She had $1 billion in the bank, a company with her name on it, and a driver who never made mistakes, and none of it mattered at all when the ice took the wheel. The car went off Ridgeline Road at 11:47 on a Tuesday night in January, and the only person who came was a man nobody knew was watching. He wasn't rich. He wasn't famous. He was just driving home. But he stopped. And what happened next on that frozen Colorado mountainside would unravel both their lives in ways neither of them ever saw coming. If you're watching this for the first time, hit that subscribe button right now and drop your city or country in the comments below. I want to see exactly how far this story has traveled. And don't forget to like this video so more people can find it. Now settle in, because this one is going to stay with you. The storm came in from the northwest the way Colorado storms always did in January, without announcing itself, without apology, and with a kind of indifference to whatever anyone had planned. By 9 o'clock that evening, the forecast on the radio had already been wrong 3 times. What was supposed to be a light dusting through the high passes had turned into something else entirely. A real system, steady and mean. The kind that turned the mountain roads into something only locals with tire chains and a certain resignation about death were supposed to be on. Ethan Cole was on Ridgeline Road because he had no choice. He'd made the run to Breckenridge that afternoon to pick up a distributor cap for old Warren Headley's '09 Ram. Warren being 74 years old and stubborn enough to refuse a rebuilt part, which meant Ethan had to special order the OEM piece from a supplier 40 minutes away. It was the kind of errand that ate a full day and paid $140. The math of running a one-man garage in a small Colorado mountain town rarely worked out the way it was supposed to, but Ethan had learned not to look too hard at that particular math. He'd stayed longer than planned. The guy at the parts counter, a heavy-set man named Dale, who had opinions about everything and the time to share all of them, had kept Ethan at the counter for the better part of 30 minutes, talking about the Broncos, the price of fuel, and some dispute with his neighbor involving a fence line and a property survey from 1987. Ethan had listened with the patience of someone who'd learned that people needed to be heard more than they needed to be rushed, and by the time he finally made it back to his truck, the parking lot had 2 inches of fresh snow on it. He'd driven back toward Ridgeline without much worry. He'd been on that road and worse. The F250 was fitted with good blizzaks and 4-wheel drive, and Ethan had a particular relationship with dangerous conditions, the kind of comfort with them that came not from recklessness, but from years of training himself to stay flat and cold in the brain when the situation outside got loud. Noah would be at Mrs. Pullman's until Ethan got back. She'd said 9 o'clock was fine, no rush. She and Noah were working on a puzzle. A 100-piece thing of a bald eagle that Noah had asked for at Christmas and only half finished. Ethan had thanked her and meant it. The women in that town who had quietly appointed themselves as additional guardians to his son were something he didn't have words for exactly. He'd tried once to explain it to his brother on the phone and hadn't managed to say it right. He just knew he was grateful in a way that sat deep. He was maybe 6 miles below the summit of Ridgeline when he saw it. The skid marks, though they were nearly invisible already under the new snow, started at a long curve where the road banked slightly outward. Bad design for a mountain road, everyone in town knew it. The county had been talking about putting up better guardrails on that curve for 3 winters running. Ethan clocked the marks before he fully registered what they meant, and then his eyes followed the dark line they traced. Across the shoulder, through the shallow snowbank, down the slope through the tree line. He'd already hit the brakes before he made a conscious decision to do so. The truck came to a stop on the shoulder, hazards blinking orange into the white dark. Ethan sat for exactly 2 seconds, then he got out. The wind was something else out there, off the truck's protection. It came sideways across the slope, carrying the fine, hard snow that wasn't really snow so much as small ice crystals that found every gap in clothing. Ethan had his work coat, a Carhartt that had seen better decades, and he pulled the collar up and moved to the edge of the drop. The slope was maybe 30 feet of steep pitch before it leveled into the tree line, and there, caught hard against the trunk of a Douglas fir with the front crumpled and the driver's side shoved inward, was a car. Not a car exactly. A Mercedes. An S-Class. One of the newer ones, black, with the kind of finish that looked expensive even in the dark and the snow. One headlight still worked, cutting a pale beam at an angle into the trees. The other was gone, or pointed somewhere useless. Steam was coming from under the hood. Not smoke. Steam, which was the better of the two options, but still not nothing. Ethan went down the slope the way he'd been trained to move on uncertain terrain. Weight back, shoulders level, feet placed deliberately rather than hurried. He slipped once, caught himself with a hand in the snow, kept going. The cold hit his palm through his glove. He got to the car and looked in through the driver's window. A woman. Alone. Slumped toward the center console, the airbag deployed and settled, white and deflated against her face like a flag that had already done its job. Mid-20s, maybe 30, though it was hard to say through the cracked glass and the bad light. She was dressed well, which registered briefly and then didn't matter. Her head was turned at an angle that wasn't quite right. Could be the crash. Could be something worse. Ethan put 2 fingers against the window, which was cracked but not shattered, and felt the warmth still trapped in the car's interior. He tried the door handle. It was jammed. The frame had flexed just enough on impact that the door wasn't going to open without something behind it. He stepped back, scanned the car. The passenger's side window had blown out completely, ice and snow already on the seat inside. He came around, reached through, and unlocked the door manually, and it opened with a scrape and a grinding sound that the cold made worse. He leaned in. "Hey." He said it the way he'd learned to say things in the field. Not loud, not soft, just direct. A tone that cut through. "Can you hear me?" Nothing. Her chest was moving. That was the first thing he checked, and it was moving. Shallow, but steady. No obvious bleeding he could see, though the visor mirror above her had snapped off, and there was a thin cut near her hairline that had bled down the side of her face and then stopped. Head wounds bled more than they should, he knew. Didn't always mean what they looked like they meant. "I'm going to move you," he said, even though she couldn't hear him. He'd found over the years that saying it out loud still mattered somehow. A habit, maybe, or just the way he was built. He checked her neck first, pressing carefully along the vertebrae with 2 fingers, feeling for anything that shouldn't be there. He'd taken a trauma course after Noah was born, one of those weekend wilderness first aid things held in a church basement in town, and he'd taken it seriously, memorized the things that could kill you slowly after an accident. The spinal damage that didn't announce itself, the internal bleeding that looked like nothing for an hour, and then everything all at once. No obvious deformity in the neck. Pulse at the carotid, present, somewhat elevated. She wasn't cold, not yet, which meant the car's heater had still been running until recently. He looked around the interior quickly. Her phone was on the center console, screen cracked across the top corner. He picked it up and tried the emergency call, and got nothing, which didn't surprise him. This stretch of ridgeline ate signals. It had always eaten signals. Another thing the county had been planning to address. He pocketed the phone. The practical problem was this. He couldn't leave her here. The temperature outside was already in the single digits and dropping, and the car was no longer sealed. The passenger's window was gone, and whatever warmth remained was leaking out steadily. She needed heat. She needed a hospital. In that order, probably. Getting her up the slope to his truck was the option, and it wasn't a good one, but it was the only one. He got her carefully into a position he could work with, both arms, one under her shoulders and one under her knees, easing her across the center console and toward the open door. She made a sound then, something between a moan and a breath. Not a word, not quite consciousness, but something. "I've got you," he said. Still that same flat, direct tone. "Just hold on." It took him 4 minutes to get her up the slope. He'd been in situations that required more and done them with worse equipment, but he had never pretended that meant anything except that the situations had been bad. His right knee, which had its own history, complained on the steeper section. He ignored it the same way he ignored most things that weren't immediately catastrophic. He got her into the truck's back seat, long enough for her to lie flat, and got the heat going full. He layered his Carhartt over her before he'd fully thought it through, which left him in a flannel and a base layer in a vehicle that was maybe 40 degrees. He didn't particularly notice. His radio, a handheld Midland unit he kept clipped to the sun visor, got through to the county dispatch on the third try, the signal bouncing off something useful for once. He gave his location in terms a dispatcher could work with: mileage marker, the curve with the bad banking, the slope to the south. He kept his voice the same way he kept his hands on these kinds of calls. Steady, unhurried, just information. Dispatch told him there was a unit 22 minutes out at the minimum. "Copy that," Ethan said. He turned the truck around on the road, a three-point that took some doing on the narrow shoulder, and started back down toward the point where Ridgeline met the county road, where the cell signal sometimes returned and where he could at least flag someone if the radio dropped out again. The woman in the back seat made that sound again, closer to something real this time. Her right hand moved and her fingers found the edge of the seat and pressed against it, like she was trying to orient herself in the dark. Ethan glanced at the rearview mirror. "You're okay," he said. "You're in a truck. You were in an accident. There's help coming." A pause. Her breathing had changed, lighter now, faster, coming awake in stages. "Where?" she started, and then stopped and started again. Her voice was raw, slightly hoarse, with something underneath it that was careful and precise, even half-conscious. "Where am I?" Ridgeline Road, Colorado, about 12 miles below Breckenridge. He watched the road ahead, adjusted his speed on a patch of gray ice. "Don't try to sit up. You had an impact and your neck might be—" "I can feel my hands." She said it almost sharply, which was, honestly, a good sign. Sharpness was a sign of a brain functioning. "I know. That's good. That doesn't mean anything else is fine." A silence. The truck's wipers worked at the windshield, steady and slow. "There was ice," she said. "On the curve, I felt the wheel go and I couldn't—" She stopped. "The curve banks outward," Ethan said. "You were going too fast for this storm on that curve. Happens. It's a bad road." "I know." And something in the way she said it made it sound like she was used to knowing things and was still figuring out how knowing hadn't been enough. Another silence. Ethan checked the rear view again. She had moved slightly, her head turned so she was looking at the ceiling of the truck, and he could see her face more clearly now in the passing light of the hazards. The cut at her hairline was dried. Her jaw was set in a way that might have been pain or might have been stubbornness, probably both. "Is there someone I should call?" he said. "Family?" "My assistant," she said. And then after a beat, something shifted in her voice, something that wasn't quite what she'd intended to let out. "Just my assistant." He didn't comment on that. It wasn't his business. "The phone in my coat," she said. "Cracked. I couldn't get a signal up there anyway. You can use mine when we get lower." She didn't respond to that. He could see her hand, the same one that had been pressing against the seat, had closed into a loose fist now, resting on her stomach. She was holding herself very still in the way people held themselves still when they were either in significant pain or working hard to stay calm, and Ethan figured it was some of both. The truck came off the upper grade and onto the lower stretch of ridgeline, and almost immediately his phone, sitting in the cup holder, lit up with signal bars. He reached over and handed it back without looking. "Here." She took it. He listened to her make the call. Just one side of it, low and controlled, a few short sentences. She was on Ridgeline Road, there had been an accident, she was in someone's vehicle, she was fine. She'd be at the county road junction in approximately 10 minutes. She gave the phone back. "Thank you," she said. "You're okay," he said, which wasn't quite the same as "you're welcome," but was what he meant. The lights of the county road appeared ahead, a thin orange wash against the snow. Ethan pulled to the shoulder just past the junction and left the engine running and the hazards on. He could hear a siren now, somewhere down the valley road. The woman behind him hadn't spoken for about 3 minutes. He thought she might have drifted again, but then she said something he almost didn't catch. "You went down that slope in the dark." "I had a flashlight," he said. "That's not—" She stopped, started again, quieter. "You don't even know my name." "That's all right," Ethan said. The lights of the ambulance appeared at the bend in the county road, cutting through the snow in steady, rotating blue. Ethan got out of the truck and walked to the edge of the road to flag them down. turning his collar up against the wind that was still running down off the mountain like it had somewhere it needed to be. The paramedics came. They were efficient and focused, and they asked their questions and did their checks. And Ethan answered what they asked of him and stepped back out of the way the moment they had what they needed. He'd given his name and number to the state trooper who arrived 4 minutes later. He'd given an account of what he'd found and where the Mercedes still was on the slope. He'd retrieved his Carhartt from the ambulance where one of the paramedics handed it back to him. He watched the ambulance pull away, lights working through the snow, until its taillights disappeared around the curve. Then he got back in his truck, turned the heat up, and called Mrs. Pullman. "I'm about 15 minutes out," he said when she answered. "Noah's still up," she said. "We finished the Eagle. He wants to show you." "Tell him I want to see it," Ethan said. He pulled back onto the county road and drove home through the snow, the radio off, his hands easy on the wheel, his knee aching the way it always did in the cold. He didn't think much about the woman in the ambulance. He thought about the distributor cap in the back seat, and whether Warren Headley's truck would be ready by Thursday, and whether the snow would let up by morning. He thought about the bald eagle puzzle. He thought about Noah. The storm was still running, still covering everything, still indifferent. And Ridgeline Road disappeared behind him in the dark, white and quiet, and already filling in the marks of everything that had happened on it. The hospital in Breckenridge was small the way mountain hospitals always were. Not quite enough of everything, but the staff moved with the particular efficiency of people who'd learned to work with what they had. Claire Whitmore spent 2 nights there, which was 2 nights longer than she'd planned to spend in Colorado at all. The diagnosis was a mild concussion, 2 bruised ribs, and a laceration at the hairline that took 4 stitches to close. The attending physician, a tired-looking woman named Dr. Reyes, who wore her hair in a bun that was losing the fight by evening, told Claire she'd been lucky. Claire heard this and understood it to be true in a technical sense, but she kept thinking about a different word. Not lucky. Helped. Someone had helped her. There was a distinction there that she couldn't quite articulate yet, and it sat at the back of her head like a stone she kept turning over. Marcus, her head of security, arrived from Denver by 7 the next morning. He stood at the foot of her hospital bed in a wool overcoat, holding a tablet, and she could see the restraint it was taking him not to lead with a list of everything that had gone wrong. Marcus had worked for her for 4 years, and he had an accountant's relationship with catastrophe. He cataloged it, organized it, and then presented it with the particular expression of someone who wanted credit for not saying "I told you so." "The car's totaled," he said. "I know." The decision to take Ridgeline in that weather, Marcus, he stopped. "I know," she said again, more quietly. He set the tablet on the tray table and clasped his hands in front of him. "There's a name. The state trooper's report. The man who called it in, Ethan Cole. He's local, lives in Faber, about 20 minutes from the summit. He's the one who—" "I know who he is," Claire said. She'd gotten the name from the trooper herself, the morning after, when her head had cleared enough to ask the right questions. "I want to know everything else." Marcus looked at her. "Everything else." "Whatever there is." She watched him note this with the particular blankness of someone who had learned not to editorialize. He typed something on the tablet. "I'll have something by this afternoon." What Marcus had by that afternoon was a file that was, in the way of most people's lives, both comprehensive and incomplete. Ethan Cole, 37 years old. Born in Durango, Colorado, second of 2 sons. Father had worked the power lines. Mother had taught 3rd grade for 26 years. Ethan had enlisted in the Navy at 19, spent 4 years as a standard rate technician before being selected for SEAL training, BUDS Class 287, one of the lower attrition classes on record, which still meant that roughly 60% of the men who started it didn't finish. He'd done it. He'd served 11 years, 3 combat deployments, and left the Navy at 32 with a record that Marcus described only as distinguished, and a look on his face that suggested the actual details were above what an afternoon's background search had returned. He had been married. A woman named Sarah, who he'd met in Faber when he was on leave visiting his brother. They'd married quickly, the way people sometimes did when one of them had a deployment scheduled in 8 weeks. Sarah Cole had died 22 months ago. Ovarian cancer, diagnosed late, which was how it usually went. Noah Cole was 6 years old and attended Faber Elementary, where his teacher's name was Ms. Garrett. Ethan currently operated Cole's Auto and Repair out of a garage attached to his property on Creek Road in Faber. Business registration, all current. Tax filings, all current. No outstanding debt beyond a mortgage that was modest even by Mountain Town standards. Claire read the file twice, lying in the hospital bed with the snow still falling against the window, and then set the tablet face down on her lap and looked at the ceiling for a long time. She had been rescued before, or something close to it. There had been the situation in Jakarta 4 years ago when her convoy had been rerouted through a district that wasn't safe, and 2 of her security team had put themselves between her and something she never fully saw. She had sent both men bonuses that were, by any reasonable measure, excessive. They had accepted them. That was how that had worked. It had been a transaction, clean and mutual, and she had moved past it in the way she moved past most things, with her attention already on the next thing. But Ethan Cole had not waited to be thanked. He hadn't left a name or a number, or even made sure she was conscious before the ambulance came. He had gone down a frozen slope in a January blizzard, gotten a stranger out of a crumpled Mercedes, driven her to safety, and then apparently collected his coat from a paramedic and driven home. The trooper had told her that Ethan's only comment during the on-scene debrief had been to note the condition of the curve where the accident happened and suggest the county look at the banking angle and the guardrail situation before spring. He hadn't mentioned himself at all. Claire spent the drive back to Denver, Marcus driving, she in the back with her laptop open and mostly unused, doing something she didn't normally do. She thought about why, not why he'd helped. She understood that people helped in emergencies. What she couldn't work out, and what kept pulling at her with the persistence of something unresolved, was the fact that he'd had no idea who she was. The Mercedes could have told him something, maybe. The quality of her clothes. But she'd been unconscious, barely coherent. There had been nothing transactional available, no possibility of recognition or reward or connection to power. And he had gone down that slope anyway. Everyone in Claire's life, by this point, knew who she was before they said hello to her. The last genuinely neutral first impression she could remember receiving had been so long ago she couldn't place it. She opened a new document on her laptop, typed one line, and stared at it. Then she closed the laptop. She'd made a decision somewhere between the hospital and the highway, though she couldn't say exactly when. It took her 2 weeks to act on it. The delay was not hesitation, or not entirely. Her company, Whitmore Group, was in the middle of a board presentation cycle that had been on the calendar for 3 months and could not be moved. There were calls, and there were dinners, and there was the particular exhausting performance of being Claire Whitmore in rooms where everyone was watching to see if the accident had affected her in some visible way. She gave them nothing. She had been giving rooms nothing for 10 years. It was among her most perfected skills. But she caught herself, on the 3rd morning back in her Denver penthouse, standing at the floor-to-ceiling window with her coffee going cold in her hand, thinking about a 6-year-old boy she'd never met who was working on a bald eagle puzzle. She'd heard it through the truck's ceiling. Half-conscious, drifting in and out, she'd still caught the end of his phone call. "Tell him I want to see it," said the same way he said everything else. No performance in it, no audience for it, just a man telling someone to tell his kid he was coming home. She'd cried on the way back to Denver, which she hadn't expected. Quietly, facing the window so Marcus wouldn't see. She wasn't entirely sure what she was crying about, which made it worse somehow. 2 weeks after the accident, Claire Whitmore drove herself. No Marcus, no company vehicle, just a rented Subaru she picked up at the Denver airport lot, to Faber, Colorado. She told Marcus she was taking personal time, which was a phrase she had never used in 4 years of employment and which had caused him to stand very still for a long moment before he nodded. She told herself she was going to say thank you in person. That was the reason she gave herself. It was not entirely untrue. Faber was the kind of town that looked smaller from the road than it actually was. The main street ran about 4 blocks before it hit the creek that gave the road its name, and the businesses along it had the permanent, unhurried quality of places that had stopped trying to be anything other than what they were. A hardware store, a diner, a post office that shared its building with what appeared to be a tax preparation service. 2 bars, which was one more than might seem reasonable for the population, but made sense if you knew anything about mountain winters. Cole's Auto and Repair was not on the main street. It was on Creek Road, about a quarter-mile past where the pavement turned to gravel, and Claire almost missed it because the sign, hand-lettered on a piece of reclaimed board, painted dark green with white letters, was half covered by the branch of a pine that had grown toward it over what had clearly been several seasons. She pulled into the gravel lot and sat in the Subaru for a moment. The garage was a 3-bay structure attached to a house that was clean and kept but not particularly anything else. Aluminum siding, a covered porch, a swing on the porch that had the look of something used regularly. One of the garage bay doors was open, and she could hear the sound of an air compressor cycling on and then settling, and underneath it a radio playing something country and not recently recorded. She got out of the car. She was dressed differently than she would have been on any professional occasion. Jeans, a plain wool sweater, boots without a heel. She had looked at herself in the bathroom mirror of the gas station in Silverthorne, where she'd stopped for coffee and thought, "You look like someone trying to look normal," which was exactly the problem with people who weren't normal trying to look it. The effort showed. The garage smelled like oil and cold concrete and something faintly metallic that she didn't have a word for, but that felt like work, real work, the kind that left marks on your hands. He was under a truck, not the F250, a different one, older, a red Dodge that had some rust developing along the wheel wells. Just his legs were visible, denim and work boots, and one hand holding a wrench, and the sound of him doing something methodical and careful. "Be with you in a minute," he said, without coming out from under the truck. His voice was the same as she remembered it from the back seat of the F250, even, unhurried, but she recognized it immediately, which was strange because she had only heard it when she was barely conscious. "Take your time," she said. A pause. Then the rolling sound of the creeper, and Ethan Cole came out from under the Dodge and sat up, and looked at her. He had a face that had been lived in, not old. He was 37, she knew that from the file, but there were lines at the corners of his eyes that came from squinting into sun and wind rather than from age, and his jaw had the kind of set that suggested it didn't move much unnecessarily. He was bigger than she'd realized, which made sense. She'd been horizontal the only time she'd seen him, with the particular build of someone who used their body as a tool rather than as something to be maintained for appearance. He recognized her. She could see it happen. It was not a dramatic thing. His expression didn't change in any obvious way. But something shifted behind his eyes, a brief recalibration, like a man checking a measurement twice. "You shouldn't be driving," he said. "The concussion was 3 weeks ago," she said. "I'm cleared." He looked at her for another moment, then got up off the creeper and pulled a shop rag from his back pocket and wiped his hands with it, which was mostly a reflex because the rag was already nearly as dirty as his hands. He tossed it onto the workbench. "You came all the way out here," he said. It wasn't a question exactly. "I wanted to say thank you, in person." She held his gaze, because she had learned a long time ago that people who looked away when they said important things were not believed. "What you did, going down that slope, you had no reason to." "Someone was in the car," he said. "That's not always enough reason for people." He seemed to consider whether to say something to that, and then didn't. He moved to the side of the garage where a steel utility sink was mounted to the wall and turned the tap on and actually washed his hands this time, methodically with the soap dispenser that was mounted above the sink. "You want coffee?" he said. "I've got a pot inside." This was not what she'd expected him to say. "Sure," she said, after a beat. The inside of the house attached to the garage was, she didn't have a better word for it, inhabited. Not cluttered, but full. The kitchen table had a puzzle box on it, not the bald eagle, a different one, a map of Colorado. And next to it a drawing, crayon on white paper, that showed what appeared to be 2 figures standing next to a very large brown rectangle she eventually identified as a truck. The refrigerator was covered in school papers and drawings held up with magnets shaped like different states. A pair of small sneakers sat next to the back door at an angle that suggested they had been taken off in motion. Ethan poured 2 mugs from a drip machine that was old enough to have been purchased before Noah was born and set one on the counter in front of her. She picked it up. It was strong in a way that suggested he either didn't notice or preferred it. "How did you find the place?" he said. He leaned against the opposite counter with his own mug, not quite blocking the room, but occupying it in the way that people who were used to being the largest physical presence in a space tended to do without knowing it. "Your name was in the state trooper's report," she said. He nodded. No particular reaction. "I looked you up," she said, because she'd decided on the drive here to be straightforward about that much. "I know you were a SEAL. I know you've been running the garage for about 3 years. I know about your wife." She paused. "I'm sorry about your wife." Something moved across his face and then was gone. "Thank you," he said. The kitchen was quiet for a moment. Through the window above the sink, she could see the pine tree that was claiming the sign at the lot entrance, its branches moving slightly in the wind. "So," he said, "you found me. You said thank you. What else?" It was a blunt thing to say, and she appreciated it more than she expected to. She'd had enough conversations in the last 3 weeks that were careful and circling and full of things not quite said. "I'm not sure, honestly," she said. "I think I needed to see you were real." He looked at her with an expression she couldn't read. "What does that mean?" "It means that everyone I work with, everyone around me, they know who I am before I walk in the room. The way you treated me in the truck, it was just—" She stopped, aware that she was edging towards something that was going to sound self-pitying or strange. "You talked to me like I was just a person in your back seat." "That's what you were," Ethan said. "I know." She set the mug down on the counter. "I know that's what I was. And I haven't been just a person in someone's back seat in a really long time." He was quiet for a moment, looking at her with the same careful attention he probably gave to something broken that he was trying to diagnose. Then he said, "What's your name? Your actual name, not your name from the report." She paused. "You know my name. I know what it says in the report. I want to hear you say it." She almost smiled. "Claire." "Ethan," he said, which was unnecessary given that she'd just told him she'd looked him up, but somehow felt like the right thing for him to say. That was a Tuesday in late January. She came back on Friday, which she told herself was because she had a meeting in Breckenridge that was scheduled anyway, and Faber was nearby, which was technically true and completely beside the point. This time, a boy was in the garage. He was sitting on an overturned milk crate near the open bay door, drawing in a spiral notebook with a blue pen, his tongue slightly out in concentration. He was small for 6, she thought, with his father's coloring, dark hair, olive skin, and a pair of glasses that were slightly too big for his face, one earpiece bent at an angle that suggested a previous repair with the wrong materials. He looked up when she came in. "Hi," he said. "Hi," she said. "Are you here about your car?" "Not exactly." "My dad's in the back getting a part." He looked at her with the open, assessing directness of children who haven't learned yet that staring is considered rude. "You were here Tuesday." "I was," she said, slightly surprised. "I saw you from the window." He returned to his drawing, apparently satisfied. "My dad said you were a person he helped one time." "He did help me," she said. "A lot." "He helps a lot of people," Noah said, with the matter-of-fact tone of someone stating a known feature of the landscape. "He helped Mr. Gunderson get his tractor unstuck for free because Mr. Gunderson only has his pension." She didn't say anything. She was looking at the drawing in the notebook, or rather she was trying to see it from where she stood without being obvious about it. It looked like mountains, or a person, or possibly a mountain-shaped person. "What are you drawing?" she asked. He turned the notebook to show her. It was a house, or it was trying to be. The perspective was the compressed frontal style of young children's drawings, but there was something in it that was more careful than random. The windows were symmetrical. There was a tree and a truck and a figure standing outside. "Is that your house?" she said. "Our house," he pointed with the pen. "That's Dad. I usually put me in 2, but I ran out of room on this side." Ethan came through the back door of the garage then, carrying a box of something, and stopped when he saw her. "Friday," he said. "I had a meeting in Breckenridge," she said. He looked at her for a moment. "Sure," he said, without inflection, and she couldn't tell if that meant he believed her or that he'd decided not to challenge it. "She knows you helped her," Noah told his father without looking up from the notebook. "I know she knows," Ethan said. He set the box on the workbench. "You eat lunch?" She'd had half a granola bar in the car and a coffee from the Silverthorne gas station again. "Not really," she said. "We were going to go to the diner," Noah said. "They have the soup today. Dad, can she come?" Ethan looked at his son, then at Claire, with the expression of a man whose 6-year-old had just casually upended the conversation. "She might have things to—" "I don't," Claire said, which was how she ended up at a corner booth at the Faber Diner, which was called, straightforwardly, Mountain View Diner, though the view from the window was mostly of the hardware store across the street, eating vegetable soup with oyster crackers, while Noah explained to her, in considerable detail, the difference between his two favorite kinds of rocks, which were obsidian and something he called the gray sparkly kind that Ethan had translated for her as granite with high mica content. She asked questions. Real ones, not performed ones. She had been in enough conversations to know the difference herself. She asked Noah what grade he was in and what he thought about it, and whether he had a best friend. And he answered all of these seriously and at length. He was in first grade. He thought math was okay. And reading was good. And lunch was the best part. His best friend was a boy named Cooper, who had a dog named Tank. Ethan sat across from her and let Noah run the conversation, which was clearly the natural order of things at the diner table. He ate his soup without ceremony and watched Claire with the same careful attention she kept catching him in. Not unfriendly, not warm exactly, just observant, the way someone looks when they're trying to figure out what something actually is versus what it looks like. At one point, Noah went to the bathroom, and the table was quiet for a moment. "You're not what I expected," Ethan said. "What did you expect?" "Someone who sends a check," he said, "and a card." She looked at him. "Would that have been enough?" He thought about that. "For most people, yeah." "I'm not—" She stopped. "I just wanted to say it in person." "You said it Tuesday," Ethan said. She didn't answer that. He didn't push. He just picked up his coffee mug and looked out the window at the hardware store, and she got the sense he was the kind of man who could sit in silence without needing to fill it, which was rarer than people thought. Noah came back from the bathroom and climbed into the booth next to his father and resumed the rock conversation at the exact point where he'd left it, which she found oddly comforting. She came back the following week, and the week after that. She told herself different things about why each time. The Breckenridge meetings, which were real but not sufficient. The drive, which was easier than she'd expected and had a view of the mountains that the highway didn't give you. The soup at the Mountain View, which was good but not exceptional. She started using a different name at the garage, not a dramatic alias, just her middle name, which was Lee, and which she offered the second Friday when she arrived and the woman from 2 doors down was getting her oil changed, and Ethan introduced her, easily and without apparent thought, as Lee the way someone might introduce an acquaintance from a parallel part of their life. She hadn't corrected him, and he hadn't looked at her when he said it. But afterward, when the other woman had gone, he'd said, "You don't have to tell people who you are." She hadn't asked him to cover for her. He'd just known and done it, and offered no commentary on the ethics of it. She thought about that for a long time on the drive back to Denver. Noah had started expecting her. That was the thing she hadn't anticipated and couldn't quite manage her feelings about. He began reserving things for when she came, not deliberately, or at least not with any visible calculation, but just the way children held things they were excited about until the right audience was present. The rock collection, which lived in a shoebox on his bedroom windowsill, which she'd seen through the garage window once and asked about, became a topic he returned to each time she arrived. He showed her new additions. He explained provenance. This one, from the creek behind the school. This one from the parking lot of the gas station on Route 9. This one from the mountain, which his dad had found and given him. Ethan watched this happening. She could see him watching it. And she couldn't tell from his face what he thought about it. One evening, mid-February, she stayed later than she'd meant to. Noah had talked her into playing a card game, a simple thing, Crazy Eights, which she had not played since she was a child and was worse at than she expected. And by the time 2 rounds were finished, the light outside had gone from late afternoon gray to the hard, flat dark of a Colorado winter night. "You should eat before you drive back," Ethan said. It was not quite an invitation. "I'm fine," she said. "Roads will ice up at sunset." He stood at the kitchen counter, which she'd come to understand was his default location in the kitchen. He didn't sit easily unless Noah needed him to. "I'm making chili. It's not complicated." "Okay," she said. Noah cheered, which was disproportionate enough to the moment that both of them looked at him. He was already putting the cards away, very efficiently, like someone who wanted the table cleared before anyone could change their mind. It was a strange meal, and she thought about it for a long time afterward. Not because anything significant happened, nothing did. Ethan's chili was what he'd said it was, not complicated. It had clearly been made in large quantities with the intention of lasting several days, and it was the kind of food that tasted like effort rather than ambition. Noah put crackers in his and talked about a movie he'd seen at Cooper's house on the weekend. Ethan ate with the systematic efficiency she'd noticed he brought to most physical things, and asked Noah 2 or 3 follow-up questions about the movie that were precise enough to suggest he'd actually been listening and not just nodding. She sat at that table and felt something she recognized distantly as hunger, not for the chili, though she finished her bowl, but for this specific unremarkable thing. A table, a kid with crackers, a man who asked real questions. She drove home in the dark, on roads that were icing the way Ethan had said they would, and she kept both hands on the wheel and didn't think about much at all until she was back in the penthouse with the city spread out below the window. And then she sat on the couch without turning the lights on and let herself feel how large and quiet the apartment was. What she hadn't told Ethan, in the 3 weeks she'd been coming back to Faber, was that the name Lee wasn't entirely innocent. She wasn't just avoiding the awkwardness of celebrity. She knew, with the part of her that was professionally honest with herself, that if he knew she was Claire Whitmore, not just the woman he'd pulled from a Mercedes, but Claire Whitmore, the company, the board, the billion-dollar valuation, the Forbes profile, all of it, something would change. It always changed. She'd watched it change her whole adult life, the moment recognition entered a room and rearranged everyone in it. She wasn't ready for that. She wasn't sure she would be. But she also knew, and this was the part she couldn't resolve, lying there on the dark couch with the city lights coming through the floor-to-ceiling glass, that Ethan Cole was not a man who missed much. He'd known she was hiding something from the first Friday. She could see it in the way he looked at her sometimes, careful and still, like he was leaving space for her to say it herself. She didn't know how long that space would last, and she didn't know what would be left of the thing they were building, quietly, impractically, in a diner booth and a kitchen in a mountain town, when it ran out. It was a Tuesday in early March when Ethan found out. Not because Claire told him, not because she finally decided the time was right or worked up to it with some prepared speech she'd been rehearsing on the drive from Denver. It happened the way most things happened that people weren't ready for. Sideways, without warning, in the middle of something completely ordinary. Noah had a half day at school, a teacher training thing, which Ethan had marked on the calendar above the kitchen phone and then half forgotten until Mrs. Pullman called at noon to say she could pick Noah up if Ethan was stuck at the garage. He wasn't stuck. The afternoon was light, just an oil change for the Henderson Civic that he could finish in 40 minutes. So he drove to the school himself and picked Noah up, and they stopped at the grocery store on the way back because they were out of milk, and Noah had been lobbying for a specific brand of crackers for 2 weeks with the patient persistence of someone who understood that attrition was a valid strategy. He was standing in the cereal aisle, half listening to Noah's case for the crackers, when he saw the magazine. It was a business publication, the kind of thing that sat in the checkout lane rack between the gossip weeklies and the TV guides, unremarkable in its genre. He wouldn't have looked twice at it normally. But the cover photograph stopped him the way very few things stopped Ethan Cole. She was in a dark blazer, standing in what looked like a glass and steel conference room, her hair up in a way she never wore it in Faber. The expression was different too, not unfriendly exactly, but composed in a way that was entirely unlike the way she looked when Noah was explaining granite mica content to her over soup. She looked like someone performing authority, and performing it very well. The headline below her photograph read, "Claire Whitmore and the Future of Whitmore Group. How the youngest female CEO in Fortune 500 history is rewriting the rules." Ethan stood in the cereal aisle and looked at the magazine for what was probably 15 seconds, but felt longer. Then he put it back in the rack. Dad, Noah was at his elbow. You didn't answer about the crackers. Get the crackers, Ethan said. He was quiet on the drive home. Noah, who was not a child who required conversation to be comfortable, filled the silence with a detailed account of what had happened at school that morning. Something involving a fire drill and a misunderstanding about whose coat was whose, and Ethan listened and said the right things at the right intervals, because that was what you did. You didn't put the weight of your own thoughts on a 7-year-old who'd just been talking about coats. But his mind was somewhere else entirely. He'd known something was off from the beginning, not in a way he could have articulated to anyone, more like the particular awareness that came from years of operating in environments where the thing you couldn't name was often the thing that mattered most. She was careful. Not dishonest in her manner, not performed in the way of someone running a specific game, but careful, choosing what she said and what she didn't. Arriving in a rented car, using her middle name with the neighbor woman from 2 doors down in a way that he'd quietly cooperated with without ever fully examining why. He told himself it wasn't his business. People came to Faber to be somewhere different from where they normally were. He knew that about the town, had known it since he came back from the Navy and settled here because he needed somewhere that didn't ask him to be what he'd been. He'd given her the same courtesy he'd have wanted for himself, and he hadn't pushed, and he'd watched her sit at his kitchen table and listen to his son talk about rocks with something on her face that he hadn't been able to classify but hadn't looked like performance. That was the part he kept returning to on the drive home. The part that made the magazine cover difficult in a way that went beyond just the lie of the name. She'd been in his house. She'd eaten at his table. Noah had started saving things for her. He got home, put the groceries away, set Noah up at the kitchen table with the crackers and a glass of milk and the Colorado map puzzle he hadn't finished yet, and went into the garage. He stood at the workbench and looked at the tools hanging on the pegboard above it, each one in its place, the outlines traced in black marker on the board so he always knew what was missing. And he thought about what he was going to do with what he now knew. The answer, when it came, was simpler than he expected. He wasn't going to do anything. He was going to wait for her to come on Friday and see if she said it herself. He thought there was maybe a 40% chance she would. She didn't. She arrived on Friday at her usual time, just after noon, in the rented Subaru that she'd been driving for 6 weeks now. He met her in the garage, where he was halfway through a brake job on a neighbor's pickup, and she was wearing jeans again and carrying a paper bag from the bakery on the main street, which she'd started doing 4 or 5 weeks back, bringing something for Noah, coffee cake or muffins, because she'd noticed the first time that he ate whatever was in the bag with the focused seriousness of someone for whom baked goods were a significant event. "Noah's in school," Ethan said. "I know, She set the bag on the workbench. "I was in Breckenridge again." "Right," he said. He went back to the brake job. She stood near the workbench and watched him work in the way she'd started doing, not filling the silence with noise, which he'd noticed and appreciated early on. She'd learned, or maybe she'd always known, that a garage was not a place that needed conversation as wallpaper. He let it go for about 10 minutes. Then he said, without looking up from the caliper he was compressing, "How long have you been running Whitmore Group?" The garage went quiet in a way that was different from the silence before. He could hear it change. He set the tool down and straightened and looked at her. Her face had done something careful and then stopped doing it. And what was underneath was not panic, he didn't think. More like the expression of someone who had been waiting for something and now that it had arrived weren't entirely sure they were ready for it anyway. "How long have you known?" she said. "Couple weeks," he said. She closed her eyes for a moment, then opened them. "The magazine rack at the grocery store?" "Checkout lane." She exhaled slowly. It wasn't quite a laugh, but it had something of the same quality, the involuntary release of something that had been held. "I should have—" She stopped, started again. "I was going to tell you." "Okay," he said. "I mean it." "I know you mean it," Ethan said. He picked up a shop rag and wiped his hands, same reflex as always, whether the rag was clean or not. "What I'm trying to work out is why you didn't." She looked at him for a long moment. He could see her deciding how honest to be, not the decision of someone constructing a deflection, but the harder decision of someone figuring out how much of a real thing they could say out loud without it falling apart in the saying. Because the minute you know who I am, she said, everything changes. You don't know that. I do know that. She said it without heat, just flatly. I have watched it happen my entire adult life. I walk into a room and people rearrange themselves. They decide what they want from me before I've said a word. The ones who don't want anything from me decide to resent me for what I have. Either way, I'm the same thing to them. I'm Whitmore. I'm the company. I'm the number. She paused. You didn't know any of that. When I was in your back seat, you talked to me like I was just someone who needed help. You were someone who needed help, Ethan said. I know. She looked away from him, toward the open bay door and the gravel lot and the pine tree claiming the sign. And I didn't want it to stop. I know it wasn't fair to you. Ethan leaned back against the truck he'd been working on and crossed his arms. Not defensively, but in the way of someone settling into a conversation that needed to be had properly. It's not really about fair to me, he said. She looked back at him. Noah's been saving rocks to show you, he said. He told Cooper about you. He told his teacher he had a new friend who came on Fridays. He kept his voice level because this wasn't an accusation and he didn't want it to land like one. He doesn't have a lot of people in his corner, and the people who are there I've been careful about. After Sarah, I've been real careful. The way her face changed when he said Sarah's name was not something she could have controlled, he thought. It was a small thing, a slight tightening around the eyes, something that moved through her expression and then was gone. But he'd seen it. I know, she said quietly. I know that. Then help me understand why it's okay. It's not. She said it straight, no cushion under it. It's not okay. I kept telling myself there would be a right time, and I kept finding reasons why this particular time wasn't it, and that's the thing I do. I find reasons to keep moving instead of stopping long enough to say the thing that's going to cost me something. She held his gaze. I'm sorry. Not as a thing you say to make a problem go away. Actually, sorry. He looked at her for a moment. Then he pushed off the truck and picked up the caliper again and went back to the brake job because there was still work to do, and standing still in the middle of a garage didn't make anything clearer. She didn't move. He could see her in his peripheral vision, standing near the workbench, not sure if she'd been dismissed. You can stay, he said, if you were going to wait for Noah. A pause. Then the sound of her pulling the tall shop stool from the corner, the one Noah used when he was keeping him company, and settling onto it. They stayed like that for the better part of an hour. Him working, her on the stool, the radio doing its thing in the background. She didn't fill the silence. He didn't ask her to. Somewhere around the 40-minute mark, when he'd moved to the rear axle, she said, I'll answer any question you want to ask. He thought about that for a while before he said anything. The meeting's in Breckenridge, he said. Real, she said. Not frequent enough to justify the trips. And Lee, my middle name, Claire Lee Whitmore. She paused. My mother called me Lee until I was 12. Then I started going by Claire because I thought it sounded more serious. 12-year-old logic. He almost said something to that and decided not to. The Subaru, he said. Rental. So nobody runs the plates. He stopped working for a moment. Does that happen? More than you'd think. He went back to work. After another few minutes, he said, The accident. On Ridgeline. You were coming from somewhere. A dinner. A client thing in Aspen for the company. I was supposed to have a driver, and I sent him back because I wanted to drive myself, and I thought I knew the roads better than I did. She said this without self-pity, just the flat accounting of a mistake. I hadn't been on Ridgeline in January before. I didn't know the curve. Now you do, Ethan said. Now I do, she agreed. Noah came home at 3:15, off the school bus, and came through the back door of the garage with his backpack still on and his glasses already slightly askew, and stopped when he saw Claire on the stool. His face did the thing it did when something he'd been hoping for happened. Not a big performance, just a kind of quiet brightening, like a light coming on in a room. You're here on a Friday, he said, as though this were remarkable, though it had been happening for weeks. I am, she said. He looked at the paper bag on the workbench. Did you bring the coffee cake? I did. The one with the crumbles on top? Noah, Ethan said from under the truck. I'm just asking, Noah said, with the dignity of someone making a reasonable inquiry. He looked at Claire. He doesn't like me to ask. Crumbles on top, she confirmed. Noah took the bag and went into the house without further ceremony, and Claire looked at the place he'd been standing and said nothing, and Ethan came out from under the truck and sat up on the creeper and looked at her, looking at the door his son had just gone through. He's going to ask you about the rocks, Ethan said. I know. And the way she said it, the matter-of-factness of it, like she'd already made room in herself for this specific future moment, was something Ethan felt in a way he hadn't expected to. He didn't say anything about that. He got up and went to the sink. What happened over the following 3 weeks was not a dramatic reconciliation of the kind that made for clean stories. Ethan was not a man who processed things quickly and then moved on. He'd spent 11 years in environments where the wrong read on a person's intentions could end badly, and that had made him thorough in a way that was both a strength and, Sarah had told him once, sometimes a trial to be around. He did not suddenly trust Claire completely because she'd admitted the things she'd been withholding. Trust, for Ethan, was not a door you opened with a key. It was more like a road you built, yard by yard, and the road to Claire was not yet built. But he also wasn't able to unfeel what he'd been feeling. That was the honest part of it. The party turned over in the dark at night after Noah was asleep. He'd been a careful man for 3 years. Careful with his grief, careful with the garage, careful with Noah, keeping the circle small and the walls at a manageable height. And then a woman had shown up in a rented Subaru with bakery bags and a middle name she hadn't used since she was 12, and somehow she'd gotten inside the perimeter before he'd fully noticed. He thought about Sarah, not with guilt exactly, more with the particular ache of someone who misses a person and is simultaneously aware that the missing is not the same as being stuck. Sarah had been practical about herself and about him. It was one of the things he'd loved most about her. And he thought if she could have said anything to him about this specific situation, it probably would have been, "You're allowed to be an idiot about this if you want, but don't let Noah pay for it." He wasn't going to let Noah pay for it. He started talking to Claire differently, not warmer exactly, or not only warmer, but with less managed distance. He started asking her actual questions about the company, about how she'd come to run it at 30, about what the board meetings were like, and whether she liked the work or just needed it. He'd expected the answers to be the kind of corporate speak he'd tuned out at every government briefing he'd ever sat through, but they weren't. She talked about the company the way he talked about an engine he was trying to fix, specifically with irritation at the parts that didn't work and a particular satisfaction about the parts that did. The logistics division is a mess, she said one evening, both of them at the kitchen table after Noah was in bed, with mugs of coffee that had both gone lukewarm without either of them noticing. I've got a VP who's been there since my father started the company and who has very strong opinions about how things should be done that are basically all wrong. Can you fire him? In theory. But he knows where everything is buried, literally and figuratively. She wrapped both hands around her mug. My father built this company for 30 years and left me extremely good infrastructure and extremely confusing politics. The two things are connected, which is part of the problem. When did he leave you the company? When I was 26. She paused. He didn't die. He had a stroke, and it affected his cognition enough that he couldn't run operations anymore. He's still alive. He lives in Scottsdale and plays golf badly, and calls me every Sunday. Ethan noticed that she said this last part in a way that was deliberately neutral, the way people were deliberately neutral about things that had more texture to them than they wanted to get into. He didn't push. Your mother? He said. Not in the picture, since I was 8. She said this the same way, flat and final, a door marked clearly so people didn't accidentally walk through it. It's fine. I've had a long time to have feelings about it. He nodded. He understood the mechanism of that. The feelings processed into something manageable over enough time so you could report on them without them reporting on you. What about your brother? She asked. You have a brother. He looked at her. I looked you up too, she said, before I came the first time. I know, he said, which was true. He'd assumed it from the beginning, Someone like her didn't go anywhere without information. His name is Daniel, she said. He lives in Durango. He does, Ethan said. We talk on the phone. He came up after Sarah died and stayed 3 weeks and was better at the practical stuff than anyone I would have asked for help. He paused. He thinks I work too much. Do you? Probably. The garage doesn't run itself and I haven't figured out how to be in 2 places. She was quiet for a moment, looking at her mug. Then, I could... She stopped. Don't, he said. She looked up. Whatever you were about to offer, Ethan said, not unkindly. Don't. Her jaw tightened slightly and then released. She nodded once. He could see her understanding it, the line he was drawing, and why, even if the line was inconvenient. Whatever they were building here, it wasn't going to be built on her resources. He needed her to know that he knew the difference between what she could buy and what was actually being offered. It was the right call, and he could see she knew it too. The evening that changed things, though, not dramatically, but in the way that a small shift in a foundation changes the whole structure eventually, was a Thursday in late March. He'd had a hard day, not a catastrophic one, just the grinding kind. The Henderson oil change had revealed a transmission issue that was going to be expensive and the Hendersons were going to take it badly, and Warren Headley had called twice about the Ram, even though Ethan had been clear about the timeline, and his right knee had been giving him trouble all week in the way it did when the weather was changing, and he'd picked Noah up from school to find that Noah had had a hard day too. Something at recess, a thing with Cooper that Noah was having trouble explaining and that Ethan was having trouble parsing, but that had clearly left his son quieter than usual, which always sat badly with him. He'd made dinner, pasta, the easy kind, from a jar because he didn't have bandwidth for anything else, and Noah had eaten about half of it and then asked if he could be done, and Ethan had said yes and watched him go to his room and close the door, and then sat at the kitchen table alone with the pasta and the quiet. He called Claire. He didn't plan it. His phone was on the table and he picked it up and called her number, which he'd had for a month now, though they'd mostly only used it for logistical things. When she was coming, once when he'd needed to change a plan. He listened to it ring twice, and then she picked up, and she said his name with the slight surprise of someone whose phone didn't usually ring at 7:30 on a Thursday. Sorry, he said. I don't know why I called. A beat. Is Noah okay? He's fine. He had a bad day and he's in his room. Ethan looked at the half-eaten pasta in Noah's bowl. I had a bad day too. Different kind. She was quiet for a moment, then she said, Tell me. Not what happened, not what's wrong, just tell me. He did. He told her about the Henderson transmission and Warren Headley calling twice and the knee, and she listened without interrupting and without offering solutions, which was the thing he hadn't known he needed until she was doing it. When he was done, she said, The Henderson transmission, is that the green Civic? Gray, yes. What are you going to tell them? The truth. It's going to run them $1,200 minimum, and the alternative is they're going to be stranded somewhere unpleasant. They'll be upset. For about 5 minutes, Ethan said. Then they'll think about being stranded somewhere unpleasant, and they'll agree to the repair. You've done this before. People don't like the truth about their cars, he said, but they always come around. She laughed at that. A real one, not the careful version she sometimes deployed in situations where a laugh was socially expected. He'd learned to tell the difference. This was the real one, loose and a little surprised. I'm coming Friday, she said. I know. I'll bring the crumble cake. Noah will appreciate that, he said. What about you? He almost said something deflecting and stopped himself. Yeah, he said. I'll appreciate it too. He could hear her smiling on the other end of the line, which was a thing he wouldn't have thought you could hear, but turned out you could. She said goodnight, and he said goodnight, and he sat at the kitchen table for another few minutes in the quiet kitchen, and the quiet felt different than it had before he'd called. He didn't analyze it. He was not, by nature, a man who needed to name every emerging thing before it was ready to be named. He just noticed the difference in the quiet and then got up and washed the dishes and went to check on Noah. Noah was on his bed, not asleep, lying on his back with one of the rock books Ethan had gotten him, a children's field guide with photographs, the pages soft from use. He looked up when Ethan came in and moved over without being asked. the automatic adjustment of a kid who expected to share his space. Ethan sat on the edge of the bed. "You want to talk about Cooper?" "Not really," Noah said. "Okay." A pause. Noah turned a page in the rock book. "Dad?" "Yeah." "Is Lee your girlfriend?" Ethan looked at the field guide photograph of a piece of malachite, green and layered. He thought about what to say and settled on the version of honest that a 7-year-old could use. "We're friends," he said. "Good friends." Noah appeared to consider this. Cooper says when grown-ups are good friends, it usually means girlfriend. "Cooper's 7. He has 2 older sisters," Noah said, with the authority of someone citing credentials. Ethan almost smiled. "Go to sleep," he said. He kissed the top of Noah's head, the automatic, unremarkable gesture of a father who had been doing it since there was a small head to kiss, and turned off the bedside lamp and went into the hallway. He stood in the hallway for a moment in the dark. The following Friday, he told himself, he was going to say something to Claire. Not a big speech, nothing prepared, just the truth, the same way he told the Hendersons about their transmission. The truth was the truth. People didn't always like it for the first 5 minutes, but they came around. He thought she'd come around. He went to bed and lay in the dark and listened to the house settle and thought about that. What he didn't know, lying there in the late March darkness with the mountains outside pressing cold against the windows, was that Friday was going to be something else entirely. Not a conversation about what they were to each other, not the careful, ground-level thing he'd been thinking about. Friday was the day Noah didn't come home on the school bus. Friday was the day Mrs. Pullman called the garage at 3:40, her voice doing the thing voices did when people were trying to stay calm and losing the fight, and said that the school had called her because they couldn't reach Ethan on his cell. He'd had it inside the truck cab, volume down, while he was under the Henderson Civic doing the transmission, and that the school nurse had called an ambulance 40 minutes ago because Noah had collapsed on the playground after lunch, and that he was already at the county hospital in Breckenridge, and that they didn't know yet what was wrong. Ethan was in the truck before she'd finished the sentence. He called Claire on the way, though he hadn't thought about why until after he'd already done it. The phone rang 4 times and he thought he was going to voicemail, and then she picked up, slightly breathless, background noise of an office behind her. "Ethan?" "Noah's in the hospital," he said. "I'm on my way. I don't—" He stopped. His voice was doing something he didn't have time for. He steadied it. "I don't know what's wrong yet." A pause that lasted exactly 1 second. "I'm coming," she said. He didn't tell her she didn't need to. He didn't say it was fine or that he had it. He just said, "Okay," and drove. The county hospital in Breckenridge had 42 beds and 1 pediatric specialist on rotation, which meant that on the days she wasn't there, which was most days, the attending physicians handled whatever came in and made calls to Denver when something was beyond what 42 beds and a rotating specialist could manage. Ethan got there in 19 minutes, which was faster than the posted limit on those roads allowed, and he didn't think about that at all. The woman at the emergency intake desk had the practiced calm of someone who managed frightened people for a living and was good at it. She told him Noah was stable, which was the word they used that meant not currently in crisis, but also not yet explained, and that Dr. Amara Osei, the attending on duty, would come speak with him as soon as she could. She pointed him to the waiting area, which was 4 chairs and a low table with magazines from 4 months ago, and a window that looked out onto the parking structure. Ethan sat in one of the chairs and did not pick up a magazine. He had been in waiting rooms before, different kinds. The ones outside operating theaters and forward bases, the kind with no magazines and fluorescent light, and the particular silence of people who were trying not to think about what they were waiting on. He had learned, in those rooms, to go somewhere flat inside himself. Not numb exactly, just level. The place where panic couldn't get purchase. He went there now, and sat, and waited. Noah was stable. He held on to that word with both hands. Dr. Osei came out 23 minutes later. She was a compact woman in her mid-40s with close-cropped hair and reading glasses pushed up on her forehead, and she moved with the efficiency of someone who had too much to do and had made peace with that fact a long time ago. She pulled a chair around to face Ethan directly rather than sitting across the table, which he noticed. "Mr. Cole." She had his eyes immediately. "Noah is resting. He's on a monitor and his vitals are stable. He was conscious by the time the ambulance got him here." "What happened?" Ethan said. "The school reported he complained of dizziness during lunch recess and then lost consciousness briefly, probably 30 to 45 seconds. He came around on his own before the nurse reached him, but she correctly called it in." She paused. "We've run an initial panel. His heart rhythm was irregular when he came in. It's corrected on its own since, but we saw it clearly on the strip." Ethan was very still. In a child Noah's age, that kind of episode, syncope, which is the technical term for the loss of consciousness, combined with the arrhythmia we observed, is something we take seriously. It can be benign, and it can be something else, and we don't know yet which we're looking at. She kept her voice clear and even, information delivered without theater. "I want to get a pediatric cardiologist to look at him. The one we work with is in Denver, and she's very good. I've already put in the call." "How long?" Ethan said. It wasn't quite a complete question, but she understood it. "For her to get here? She can be here by tomorrow morning. For a full picture, the test she'll want to run, the echocardiogram, possibly a longer-term monitor. That's going to be at least a few days before we have anything definitive." She looked at him steadily. "I know that's not a clean answer." "Can I see him?" "Yes, come with me." Noah was in a room at the end of the short pediatric corridor, which was painted a yellow that was trying hard to be cheerful. He was in the bed with the rail up on one side, the monitor above him showing a green line that moved in steady, small mountains, and he looked smaller than he did at home, the way children always looked smaller in hospital beds, diminished by the scale of the equipment around them. His glasses were on the tray table. He was awake. He looked at Ethan when Ethan came through the door, and the look on his face was the specific look of a child who has been frightened and is trying not to show it in front of his parent and is not quite succeeding. "Hey, bud," Ethan said. "Hey," Noah said. His voice was normal. That helped. Ethan pulled the chair to the bedside and sat so they were at the same level. He looked at the monitor, at the green line, at Noah's face. He put his hand over Noah's hand on the blanket. "Does anything hurt?" "My head did. It doesn't now." Noah looked at the monitor above him with the expression of someone making a technical assessment. "They put things on my chest. They took most of them off." "I know, the doctor told me." "She's nice," Noah said. "She talks to me like I'm a person." "You are a person." "Some doctors talk to you like you're the problem they're looking at," Noah said. This was the most precise description of a certain kind of physician Ethan had ever heard, and it came from a 7-year-old, and despite everything he felt something almost like the urge to smile. "Dr. Osie's not like that," Noah continued. He shifted slightly in the bed. "Dad?" "Yeah." "I know you're worried." Ethan looked at his son's face. "I'm okay," he said. "You do the flat voice when you're worried," Noah said. "You've always done it." Ethan was quiet for a moment. He turned Noah's hand over and held it properly, palm to palm. "I'm a little worried," he said. "That's allowed." "Yeah," Noah said. He seemed satisfied with this. He looked at the door and then back at Ethan. "Is Lee coming?" Ethan had not thought about whether to answer this. She said she was. Noah nodded, once, with the expression of someone checking something off. They were quiet together for a while. The monitor made its small, regular sounds. Outside the window, the afternoon was going gray and flat, the particular colorlessness of a Colorado March afternoon that couldn't decide if it was still winter. "Dad?" Noah said again. "Yeah." "I want to go home." "I know," Ethan said. "We will." He said this because it was what he believed. He said it without qualification because Noah needed it without qualification, and because the alternative, saying soon or probably or we'll see, was not something a 7-year-old in a hospital bed needed to hear from his father. He said it, and he held his son's hand, and he believed it. Claire arrived at 6:17. He heard her before he saw her, her voice at the nurse's station down the hall, quiet but clear, and then the sound of her footsteps. And then she was in the doorway. She was still in what she'd been wearing when he called. Dark pants, a fitted blazer, which meant she'd come directly from whatever her afternoon had been. Her hair was down, which she usually wore up in anything professional, so she'd done something to herself between the office and here. She had a bag over one shoulder. She stopped in the doorway and looked at Noah, and something in her face did the thing it did when she wasn't curating it, open and real and slightly unguarded, the version of her face she'd been gradually letting him see over the past 2 months. "Hi," she said to Noah. "Hi," Noah said. He was already sitting up straighter. "I collapsed." "I heard," she said. "How do you feel?" "Better," he said. "My head stopped hurting. They gave me juice." He considered this. "Apple juice. I usually like orange better, but I didn't say anything because she was being nice." "That was thoughtful of you," Claire said. "Dad says you should say thank you for what people give you, even if it's not your favorite." Claire looked at Ethan. He looked back at her and said nothing. She came in and took the chair on the other side of the bed, Ethan on one side, her on the other, and set her bag on the floor, and she and Noah talked for a while in the easy way they'd developed over these months, the conversational rhythm of two people who had genuinely found something to say to each other. Noah told her about the ambulance, which he had found objectively interesting from a technical standpoint despite the circumstances, and about the things the monitors stuck to his chest had felt like coming off, and about Dr. Osei and her reading glasses. Ethan sat and listened and was grateful for the sound of it. At 7:30, a nurse came in to check Noah and gently suggested that he try to sleep. Noah accepted this with moderate resistance, one more question about the monitor and whether it would beep if he moved, and then lay back on the pillow with the air of someone submitting to the inevitable. Ethan and Claire went into the corridor. They stood near the window at the end of the hall, the one that looked out toward the parking structure, and beyond it, the edge of the mountains going dark against a sky that was one shade above black. The corridor was quiet. The nurse's station was at the other end, staffed but not busy. "He looks good," Claire said, "for a kid who—" "Yeah," Ethan said. She turned to look at him. He was aware of what he looked like. He'd come straight from under the Henderson Civic, and while he'd washed his hands at the intake desk when they let him use the staff sink, he still had a faint line of grease at his wrist that the soap hadn't fully cut. "Have you eaten anything?" she said. "I'm fine." "That's not what I asked." He looked at her. "No," he said. She reached into the bag on her shoulder and produced a wrapped sandwich from what looked like the deli at the Whole Foods in Breckenridge. She held it out. He looked at it for a moment. "You stopped," he said. "On the way," she said. "I didn't know how long you'd been here." He took the sandwich. It was turkey, which he hadn't asked for, and it was the most useful thing anyone had done in the last 3 hours. He ate it standing there in the corridor without any particular ceremony, and she stood with him and didn't say anything. When he was finished, he folded the wrapper and held it and said, "The cardiologist is coming from Denver tomorrow morning. Dr. Osei says she's good." "What's her name?" "Reyes, I think." No, different one. Patel. Dr. Sonal Patel." Claire was quiet for a moment. He watched something move across her expression. Not quite a decision, more like the approach to one. "I know of her," Claire said carefully. "She was at Children's Hospital Colorado until 2 years ago. She's one of the best pediatric cardiologists in the Mountain West." Ethan looked at her. "How do you know that?" "I funded the cardiology wing at Children's Colorado for 4 years," she said. "It's in the company's giving portfolio." She said it the same way she'd said things on the phone. Flat, informational, no cushion under it. "I'm not telling you this because I want to do something with it. I'm telling you because I think knowing the cardiologist they're sending is genuinely excellent might matter to you tonight." He considered this. "It does," he said. She nodded. He put the folded wrapper in the trash bin near the window and looked out at the parking structure. His truck was out there somewhere, in whatever space he'd pulled into at speed without looking. He couldn't remember parking it, which was a thing that happened when the brain was running on one track. "The diagnosis," he said. "Whatever it turns out to be. I don't know yet what that's going to cost." "Ethan, I need to say it," he said, not sharp, just clear. "I don't know what it's going to cost, and I don't know what my insurance covers for a specialist, and I don't know what a pediatric cardiologist and an echocardiogram and whatever else runs in a place like this." He paused. My savings are not... He stopped. He didn't have a better end to that sentence that didn't feel like something he didn't want to say out loud. The hallway was quiet. I know, she said. I'm not asking. I know you're not asking. She met his eyes steadily. I know exactly what you're not asking. You've been clear about that since February. He looked at her. But I need to say something, she said, and I need you to hear it as what it is and not as what you're afraid it is. He waited. Whatever Noah needs, she said. Whatever the procedure, the specialist, the recovery. If there's a gap between what your insurance covers and what this costs, I can bridge it. Not as a transaction, not as Claire Whitmore writing a check to manage a situation. Just as... She stopped, looked for the word, found it, and seemed to have to push slightly to say it. Just as someone who loves that kid. It was the first time either of them had used that word about anything in this situation. It landed in the corridor between them with the quiet weight of something said after a long time of not being said. Ethan was still for a moment. You do, he said. Not a question. Yeah, she said. I do. He looked at her for a long time, the way he'd learned to look at things that needed to be understood rather than just seen. She didn't look away. She had the particular steadiness of someone who'd said a real thing and was prepared to stand behind it. He loves you too, Ethan said. You know that. I know, she said quietly. Another silence. Down the hall, a nurse moved from one room to another, her shoes making a soft sound on the linoleum. I can't let you pay for his medical care, Ethan said. I know you think that. It's not a pride thing. I know it's not, she said. I know exactly what it is. You've spent 3 years making sure that everything Noah has comes from you, from what you built and what you can carry. Because after Sarah, you needed to know that the floor under you was real, that if you stood on it, it would hold. She held his gaze. I understand that. I'm not trying to take the floor away from you. He was quiet. But there's a difference, she said, between someone replacing the floor and someone just standing on it with you. He didn't answer right away. He looked out the window at the dark edge of the mountains. He thought about Sarah, about the last months of it, when the floor had been something other than solid, when he'd needed to lean on people and had found, to his surprise, that letting people carry some of the weight didn't mean he was less capable of carrying it himself. He'd forgotten that, somewhere in the 3 years since. He'd rebuilt the floor so well and so independently that he'd started to mistake the act of needing nobody for the act of being strong. Okay, he said. She blinked. Okay? Not okay you're paying for everything, he said. Okay, I'll let you help figure it out. However that looks when we know what we're dealing with. He paused. We'll figure it out together. She exhaled slowly. He thought about what it had cost her to say what she'd said. Not the offer itself, which for someone with her resources was not a financial sacrifice, but the word she'd used, the admission of it. And he knew enough about her by now to know that she didn't offer things that could be refused easily. That every time she came to Faber, she was making herself available to be told to stop coming, and she kept coming anyway. That was its own kind of courage, different from the kind he knew, but not lesser. Go sit with him, Ethan said. I'll get coffee. There's a machine by the elevator, she said. It's terrible. I know. He almost managed a smile. I've been here before. Noah broke his arm in 2nd grade. The right one, she said. Monkey bars. He stopped. How do you know that? He told me, she said, in October. Before I came the first time, I know I said I looked you up, but I want to be honest about the extent of it. I read the file Marcus put together, and it mentioned a hospital visit when Noah was 5. She paused. He told me the rest himself. He said he flew off the monkey bars, and your face went totally white, and you called it a big adventure so he wouldn't cry. Ethan stood in the corridor of the hospital and felt something move through him that wasn't quite manageable. He looked at the floor for a moment, collecting himself. He cried anyway, he said, once we got to the car. He said you did too, turned away from him first. He was 5, Ethan said. He wasn't supposed to notice. He notices everything, Claire said. He just saves it. He looked at her. Like someone else I know, she said. He didn't say anything to that. He just went for the coffee. The night was long in the way hospital nights were. Not dramatic, but enduring, made of small intervals and fluorescent light, and the periodic sounds of a building that never fully slept. Ethan and Claire traded the chair by Noah's bed in unspoken rotation, one of them always in the room, and one in the corridor or at the terrible coffee machine, until sometime after midnight when Noah was deeply and solidly asleep, and Dr. Osei came by on her rounds and told them both they should rest. There was a family lounge 2 doors down, 2 couches, and a television playing muted cable news. Claire took one couch, Ethan took the other. He didn't sleep, not really, but he drifted in and out of something near it, and at some point in the early hours he was aware that she had stopped moving on her couch too, and was probably doing the same. Dr. Patel arrived at 8:40 the next morning. She was younger than Ethan had expected from her reputation, early 40s maybe, with a direct manner and the particular quality of someone who had seen enough difficult things that she no longer needed to buffer her communication with excessive warmth. She was kind in the way of practical people, efficient kindness, targeted where it was needed. She examined Noah and reviewed Dr. Osei's notes and the heart monitor strip from the day before, and she ordered an echocardiogram and a specific blood panel and a 24-hour Holter monitor, and she explained all of this to both Ethan and Noah simultaneously, which Noah appreciated visibly, and which Ethan noticed her noticing. The echocardiogram was done by noon. Dr. Patel came to speak with Ethan at 2 o'clock in the small consultation room off the pediatric ward that had 1 window and 2 chairs and no magazines. Claire waited in the family lounge. Ethan had not asked her to, but she'd understood without being told that this was a conversation he needed to have as Noah's father and not with an audience. He came out of the consultation room 40 minutes later and stood in the corridor for a moment, and then he went to the family lounge. Claire was sitting on the couch with Noah's Rockfield guide open on her lap. She must have retrieved it from his room, and she was looking at it without really seeing it. She looked up when he came in. He sat on the couch adjacent to hers and leaned forward with his elbows on his knees. Hypertrophic cardiomyopathy, he said. The wall of his heart on the left side is slightly thickened. She said it's not severe, it's a mild presentation, and she's seen kids with this diagnosis run track in high school, but it's there, and it caused what happened yesterday, and it needs to be addressed. Claire set the field guide carefully on the cushion beside her. She wants to do a procedure, he said. An ablation. She explained it. I understood about 60%. Essentially, they go in and correct the electrical pathway that's causing the rhythm to go irregular. She's done it on kids Noah's age. She said her outcomes with this specific presentation are good. He stopped. But, Claire said. But nothing is certain, he said. That's what she was careful to say. It's a good procedure with good odds, and it's the right call, and nothing is certain. He looked at his hands. She wants to do it at Children's Colorado in Denver. Her equipment is there, and her team is there, and she said the recovery monitoring is better in a dedicated pediatric cardiac unit. He paused. I called my insurance from the consultation room. The procedure is covered at 60% after the deductible. The specialist fees are partially covered. There are going to be gaps. He said this last part with the same flatness he used for everything he needed to say, but didn't want to. He looked up at her. Tell me what you need, she said. I need to know that whatever the gaps are, he gets the procedure. Done, she said, immediately, without a breath between his sentence and hers. I'm going to pay back Ethan. She said his name the same way he'd heard her say things to people who worked for her. Not dismissive, but ending something. We're not talking about that today. He looked at her for a long moment, then he nodded. When does she want to do it? Claire said. She wants him stable for 2 weeks. The Holter monitor, more tests, optimizing his medication first. Then she said she'd schedule it within the month. Okay, Claire said. I need to tell Noah, he said. How much of this to tell him? I don't know exactly. Enough that he's not scared by what he doesn't know, not so much that he's carrying something he doesn't need to carry yet. He's going to ask you straight questions, she said. I know. And he'll know if you're not being straight back. I know that too. Ethan exhaled. I'm going to tell him his heart has a thing that needs to be fixed, and that there's a doctor who's really good at fixing it, and that he's going to need to go to Denver for a bit. He paused. And I'm going to let him ask everything he wants to ask and answer it as straight as I can. That's right, she said. He stood up. He stopped at the door and turned back. Claire. She looked up. I need to ask you something, he said. Okay. When we go to Denver, for the procedure and the recovery. He stopped, and then said the thing that had been sitting in him since the consultation room, the thing he'd been moving toward through the whole of the afternoon. Will you come? She was very still for a moment. I'm not asking you to manage it, he said. I'm not asking because of your connections at the hospital, or because it's useful to have you there. I'm asking because Noah's going to be in Denver, and I'm going to be alone in a hospital in a city I don't know well, and he's going to need... He stopped. We're both going to need someone. She stood up. Yes, she said. I'll come. He nodded. He went back down the hall to his son's room to tell Noah the truth the best way he knew how. The following 2 weeks were their own particular shape of hard, not the sharp, acute terror of the first day, but the grinding, sustained difficulty of managing uncertainty while life continued to require management. The garage needed to keep running because the bills did not pause for medical emergencies. Warren Headley needed his Ram, and the Hendersons needed their Civic, and 3 other regulars needed various things, and Ethan worked 6 days a week and drove to Breckenridge every evening to sit with Noah, who was kept in hospital for the first 5 days, and then sent home with a monitor and a list of restrictions that he accepted with the stoic pragmatism of a child who had decided to be the kind of person who handled things. No running for now, no PE, no monkey bars, which was not a current concern but which Noah had asked about specifically, cataloging future losses with the thoroughness of someone who planned ahead. Daniel came up from Durango for the first weekend. Ethan's brother, who was larger than Ethan and louder in the way of younger siblings who had compensated for not being the competent one by being the present one, and who made Noah laugh 3 times in the first hour by doing voices, which Daniel had always been able to do, and Ethan had not. He stayed 3 days and helped with the garage and didn't ask Ethan too many questions, which was exactly right. He met Claire on the second day. Ethan watched them take each other's measure over coffee at the kitchen table with the wariness of 2 people who both had prior claim on the same person and weren't sure yet if that was a problem. Daniel had gotten the briefest possible version of events, Claire's role in all of it, the name, the accident, the months of Fridays, and he was smart enough to have worked out the parts Ethan had left vague. He shook her hand. He said it was good to meet her. He said it with the specific authenticity of someone who actually meant it, and was slightly surprised to find that he did. When she went to help Noah with his homework, Daniel poured himself more coffee and said to Ethan quietly, "She came when you called." "Yeah," Ethan said. "From Denver." "Yeah." Daniel wrapped both hands around his mug. "I like her," he said. "I wanted to not like her, for the record. I had a whole position prepared." Ethan said nothing. "She sat on the floor to look at the rocks with him," Daniel said. "Nobody sits on the floor for the rocks. I always do the rocks from a standing position, and he knows it, and he accepts it, but you can tell he wishes I'd sit down." He paused. She sat down. Ethan looked at the doorway that led to the living room, where he could hear Claire's voice and Noah's, low and even, the sound of them going through a worksheet together. "Yeah," he said. "So what are you going to do about that?" Daniel said. "Probably the same thing I do about everything," Ethan said. "Work it out slow." "You don't have unlimited time on this one," Daniel said. "Just saying." "I know," Ethan said. He did know. He'd known it since the corridor of the hospital, since she'd stood there in her work clothes and said a word she'd been careful not to say until it was true. And he'd heard it and understood that she hadn't said it carelessly. She wasn't a careless woman. She didn't say things to manage situations. She said things when they were real, and this one had been real, and he'd been carrying it since. The night before they drove to Denver for Noah's procedure, Ethan put Noah to bed and then sat on the porch steps, the same steps with the swing he never used, in the cold March air, later now, almost April, and the cold had the first faint suggestion of something not quite winter underneath it. Claire came out and sat beside him on the steps. They didn't say anything for a while. The night was clear, the kind of clear you got in the mountains when the weather system had moved through and left the sky wiped clean. Stars everywhere. The pine that was claiming the sign in the lot was a dark shape against them. "Thank you," he said, "for all of it." "Don't," she said. "I mean it." "I know you mean it," she said, "but I didn't do any of it so you'd thank me." "I know that too," he said. She pulled her knees up and wrapped her arms around them, which was not a position he'd have expected from her. It was the posture of someone young, or someone allowing themselves to be young for a moment. She looked at the same sky he was looking at. "I'm scared about tomorrow," she said. "Yeah," he said. "Me too." "He's going to be okay," she said. Then, "I know you're not supposed to say that." "You can say it," he said. "I want someone to say it." She turned and looked at him. He looked back. The porch light was off, so it was just the stars and the ambient glow from the valley below doing the work, which wasn't much, which was enough. He put his hand on her hand, on the porch step between them. She turned her hand over and held his, the same way he'd held Noah's hand in the hospital room, palm to palm, which was the most basic and least complicated way to tell someone that you were with them. They sat like that for a long time. The cold came down off the mountain the way it always did. The pine moved slightly in the occasional wind. Neither of them said anything else, because everything that needed saying had been said, and sometimes the most honest thing between two people was just the evidence that neither of them was leaving. Part 5. The procedure took 4 hours and 11 minutes. Ethan knew the exact time because he'd been watching the clock on the wall of the surgical waiting room at Children's Colorado since the moment the doors closed behind the orderly who wheeled Noah through them, and the clock had become the only fixed point in a room that was otherwise just chairs and carpet, and the low ambient sound of a hospital trying to be quiet. The waiting room was larger than the one in Breckenridge. More chairs, better lighting, a coffee station that was actual coffee rather than a machine, and it was about a third full with other people doing the same thing he was doing, which was sitting with the specific weight of someone who had given the most important thing they had into other people's hands and now had nothing to do but wait. Claire sat beside him, not close enough to crowd, not far enough to be separate. Just there, in the chair next to his, with a cup of coffee she wasn't drinking. He didn't talk much. She didn't push him to. That was something he'd come to understand about her over these months. She had learned, somewhere in a life that had required her to perform constantly, the difference between a silence that needed filling and one that needed to be left alone. Most people never learned that. Most people filled every silence because the alternative felt like failure. Claire sat with the quiet like someone who had made a private peace with it, and that was one of the things about her that had gotten under his defenses before he'd fully understood it was happening. Daniel had offered to come. Ethan had told him to stay at the house. Someone needed to be there, and Daniel's presence in a waiting room tended toward the kind of anxious helpfulness that Ethan didn't have bandwidth for today. Daniel had accepted this with the good grace of a man who understood his own limitations and had sent 3 text messages by noon anyway, each one shorter and more restrained than the one before, which was its own kind of love. At the 2-hour mark, a nurse came out to tell them the procedure was progressing normally. Ethan thanked her. Claire put her hand briefly on his forearm and then took it back, and he was grateful for the brevity of it, the acknowledgement without the weight. At 3 hours, he got up and walked the length of the corridor and back, because his knee needed it, and because movement was better than stillness when the stillness got too loud. Claire watched him go and didn't follow. When he came back, she handed him the coffee she hadn't been drinking, and he took it without comment, and it was lukewarm and stronger than he'd have made it, and he drank it anyway. Dr. Patel came out at 4 hours and 11 minutes. She had her surgical cap still in one hand, which she was turning over in an unconscious repetitive gesture, and her face was the face of someone who had completed a difficult task and was carrying the result of it in their expression before they'd said a word. Ethan had learned to read faces in conditions where reading them wrong had serious consequences, and what he saw in Dr. Patel's face in the first second before she spoke was not the contained professional neutrality of bad news being managed. It was the face of someone who was tired and satisfied. "It went well," she said. She said it directly, first thing, which he appreciated. The pathway was very accessible, better than the imaging suggested. "We got a clean result." His rhythm normalized on the table and held. "He's in recovery, and he's already talking." Ethan stood in the corridor of the pediatric cardiac unit at Children's Colorado and felt something leave his body that had been living in it for 3 weeks. It wasn't dramatic. He didn't sit down or lose composure or make a sound. It was more like the release of something held so long he'd stopped noticing the effort of holding it, and the absence of it was suddenly and completely apparent. "Thank you," he said. "He's a tough kid," Dr. Patel said. "He asked me, before the anesthesia, if he could see the imaging after. I told him yes. He seemed satisfied." She permitted herself a small, tired smile. "You can see him in about 40 minutes. She went back through the doors. Ethan turned around. Claire was standing a few feet behind him, having gotten up from her chair at some point, and her arms were crossed in front of her chest in the posture of someone who had been holding themselves together with the specific effort of someone not wanting to make a difficult moment about themselves. When he turned around and she saw his face, something in her posture let go. He crossed the distance between them, and she met him halfway, and he put his arms around her, which was the first time he had done that, cleanly and without qualification, without any managed distance left in it. She held on. Her face was against his shoulder, and he could feel that she was breathing carefully, the controlled breath of someone who had been frightened and was now releasing it in increments. They stood like that in the corridor of the hospital for a long moment. Neither of them said anything. There was nothing that needed saying that the moment wasn't already saying better. Noah spent 2 nights in the hospital for monitoring, and then Dr. Patel discharged him with a follow-up schedule, a medication adjustment, and a list of restrictions that was noticeably shorter than the pre-procedure list. Running was still out for 6 weeks. PE would come back gradually. The monkey bars, the item Noah had been quietly tracking, were on the approved list for the end of the summer, which Noah received with the equanimity of someone who had been prepared for worse. "End of summer," he said to Ethan from the hospital bed, processing it. "End of summer," Ethan confirmed. "Cooper will probably have done something impressive by then," Noah said. "With Tank, probably. Probably." "I'll have to catch up," Noah said. This seemed to focus him. He looked at Dr. Patel with the expression of someone clarifying the terms of a contract. "Can I do the creek trail? The one by the school? It's not running, it's walking, but it goes uphill." Dr. Patel looked at his chart. 2 weeks? Then yes." Noah nodded, satisfied. He reached for the Rockfield guide on his tray table, which had come with him to Denver in his overnight bag, one of the 3 items he'd chosen to pack when Ethan told him to pick what he needed, and opened it to a page he'd bookmarked with a piece of garage tape. "Lee," he said without looking up, "did you know Colorado has its own state mineral?" Claire was sitting in the chair by the window. She looked up from her phone. "I didn't." "Rhodochrosite," he said. "It's red. They found it in a mine in the 1800s. He turned the book to show her the photograph. "I want one." "We'll look for one," she said. "They sell them at the rock shop in Breckenridge," he said. "I've looked at it through the window. It's $12. "That's very specific information," she said. "I've been planning," he said, and went back to the page. Ethan looked at Claire across his son's hospital bed. She met his eyes, and what passed between them in that look was not romantic in any performed sense. It was quieter than that, more worn in, the kind of look that only existed between people who had been through something together and come out the other side still standing next to each other. He drove home to Faber 2 days after Noah was discharged, Claire following in her Subaru, and Daniel met them at the house with a pot of soup on the stove and the Colorado map puzzle finished on the kitchen table, which he admitted he'd had to look up 3 pieces of because the southeastern corner of the state was, in his opinion, unreasonably monochromatic. They ate the soup, and Daniel did his voices, and Noah laughed in the helpless, full-body way of a kid whose defenses were down after a week in hospital, and the kitchen was loud and warm and cluttered. And at some point, Ethan stood in the doorway between the kitchen and the living room and just looked at the table. Daniel's large hands wrapped around a bowl, Claire smiling at something Noah had said, Noah himself already reaching for seconds with the appetite of someone whose body was doing the work of recovery, and felt something he had no clean name for. Not happiness exactly, or not only. Something more compound than that. The feeling of a man who had been walking a narrow road alone for a long time and had looked up to find that the road had widened without him noticing, and there were people on it. Daniel left the next morning. He stood at his truck in the gravel lot and shook Ethan's hand and then pulled him into the kind of hug that brothers who didn't usually hug each other did when something real had happened. He waved to Noah through the kitchen window. He shook Claire's hand and then seemed to decide something and pulled her into a brief, slightly awkward hug instead, which she accepted with the surprised expression of someone receiving more warmth than they'd budgeted for. "You're good for him," Daniel said to her, low enough that it was between them. Both of them. "I'm trying to be," she said. "That's the whole job," he said, and got in his truck and drove away. The weeks after that were different from the weeks before. Not dramatically, because the shape of their lives didn't change in any structural way, but different in the way that two things that have been placed next to each other long enough eventually stop being two separate things. Claire was in Faber most Fridays and some Tuesdays too, and she stopped pretending there was a meeting in Breckenridge that justified the drive. She just came, and Ethan just expected her, and Noah had stopped noting her arrivals as events and started treating them as background, the way you stopped noticing the furniture in a room you used every day. She worked from the kitchen table some mornings, her laptop open, the phone occasionally going to her ear for calls she stepped outside to take when they were the kind that required the CEO voice rather than the Faber kitchen voice. Ethan left her to it. He went to the garage and worked, and at noon she came out with 2 mugs of coffee and set one on the workbench and sat on the tall stool, and sometimes they talked and sometimes they didn't, and both were fine. She was not a woman who had become soft. That wasn't what happened, and anyone who watched her on those phone calls, pacing the porch in whatever weather April was producing, her voice precise and uncompromising on whatever the issue was, would not have mistaken her for someone who had set down the person she'd spent a decade becoming. She was still Claire Whitmore in every room that required it. She still ran a company with the focused ruthlessness of someone who understood that an organization with that many moving parts would fall apart the moment you stopped paying attention. But there were things she didn't do anymore that she had done before. She stopped eating lunch at her desk as a default. She started taking the Breckenridge client meetings in the afternoon instead of stacking them from 6 in the morning, which meant she could drive up the night before and be at the kitchen table by 8 rather than arriving after noon with the particular hollow energy of someone who had been in back-to-back calls since dawn. She called her father in Scottsdale on Sunday and stayed on the call longer than she used to, asking questions about things that had happened in the week rather than checking in and moving on. Small adjustments, the kind that didn't look like much from the outside, but that came from a different relationship with time. The understanding that time was not only resource to be managed, but territory to be inhabited. Marcus noticed. He didn't say anything directly because Marcus had not survived 4 years as her head of security by saying direct things unprompted, but she caught him, one morning in early May in the Denver office, looking at her schedule with an expression that was not quite a question. "What?" she said. "Nothing," he said. "Marcus." He set the tablet down. "You seem less—" He searched for a word that was accurate without being career-limiting. "Accelerated," he said. She thought about that. "Is that a problem?" "The Q2 numbers don't suggest it is," he said. "Then let's leave it there," she said. He nodded and picked up his tablet and was almost out the door when she said, "You can say it, whatever it is." He turned. He looked at her for a moment with the expression of someone calculating risk. Then he said, "I've worked for you for 4 years and I've seen you in a lot of situations, and I've never seen you make a phone call the way you made the one in April, when he called about the boy." She was quiet. "You were in the middle of a board pre-read call," Marcus said. "You picked up on the second ring, and you said, 'I'm coming,' and you hung up. You didn't tell anyone on the call what was happening. You just left." He paused. "In 4 years, I have never seen you leave something without an explanation." She looked at her desk for a moment. "He needed me there," she said. "I know," Marcus said. And then, with the careful plainness of someone who meant it, "Good." He left. She looked at the door he'd closed behind him and thought about what it meant that the most taciturn man she employed had just given her the closest thing to a blessing she was likely to receive from that quarter. The Rotocro site happened in June. She drove up on a Thursday. not a Friday, which by now was unremarkable, and picked Noah up from school, which Ethan had arranged because he had the Henderson transmission in pieces on the floor of the garage and was up to his elbows in it and couldn't break away. Noah climbed into the Subaru with his backpack and his slightly too big glasses and the particular post-school energy of a kid who had been sitting still all day and had opinions about it. "How was school?" she said. "Fine," he said. "We did fractions." "How were fractions?" "Also fine," he said. "I already knew them. Dad showed me last year." She pulled out of the school lot. "Where do you want to go before home?" He looked at her with the expression of someone who had been waiting for this question. "The rock shop," he said. She had $12 in cash in her wallet, which she gave him in the rock shop while he stood in front of the display case with the focused deliberation of someone making a significant acquisition. The piece of rhodochrosite he chose was roughly the size of a golf ball and deep red, banded, with one facet that had been polished and one left rough. He turned it over in his hands twice, checking both surfaces, and then placed it on the counter with the cash and said thank you to the woman at the register with the reflexive politeness that Ethan had clearly been installing in him since before he could properly pronounce it. In the car, on the way back to Creek Road, he held the rock in his lap and looked at it. "It's for the collection," he said. "I know. But it's also—" He paused, searching for the word with the seriousness of a child for whom language was occasionally insufficient. "It's also for remembering this." She glanced at him. "Remembering what?" He looked out the window at the mountains, which were doing the thing they did in June, the snow pulled back to the high peaks, the lower slopes gone green and bright with the quickness of a mountain spring that knew it had limited time. "All of it," he said. "The part where you came and then kept coming." She drove for a moment without saying anything. "I'm going to keep coming," she said. He nodded, apparently already aware of this. "Noah," she said. "Yeah." "Is that okay? That I keep coming?" He looked at her with the frank, uncomplicated assessment of a child for whom the answer was so obvious it was mildly puzzling that she'd needed to ask. "It's better than okay," he said. "It's the best part of the week." She kept her eyes on the road because the road required it, and for no other reason. "The best part," she said. "Well," he said, with the honesty of someone committed to accuracy. "The soup at the diner is also very good." He considered. "But you're better." She had been in board meetings where people said things that were meant to be meaningful and weren't, and she had listened to speeches about legacy and impact and the importance of what they were building, and none of it had landed with the weight of a 7-year-old telling her she was better than the soup at the Mountain View Diner. She thought about all the rooms she'd walked into over the past decade, all the people who had rearranged themselves when she arrived, who had calculated what she was worth to them before she'd said a word. She thought about the years of being managed and courted and handled, of never quite knowing whether the person across the table was responding to her or to what she represented. And she thought about how she'd gotten used to it in the way you got used to any chronic condition. You stopped noticing it until someone showed you what it felt like without it. Ethan had shown her. Noah had sealed it. This was what she'd come looking for, that first Friday in January, without knowing she was looking for it. Not gratitude, not closure, not even the simple human satisfaction of saying thank you to someone face to face. She'd been looking for a room where she was just a person in it, where the people who looked at her saw her, specifically, and not the company or the number or the name. She'd found it in a garage on Creek Road where the sign was being eaten by a pine tree, and it hadn't been anything like what she'd expected, and it had been exactly what she needed. The evening in early July when Ethan said the thing he'd been carrying since the hospital porch happened without ceremony, which was the only way it could have happened between two people who were both more comfortable with the real than the performed. Noah was in bed. They were on the porch steps again. The same steps, the same dark. Though July dark was warmer and the stars had the quality of summer stars, higher and more numerous. The swing moved slightly in the light wind. He'd been quiet for a while in a particular way that she recognized by now as preparation, not hesitation, just the way he gathered himself before he said something that mattered. "I need to tell you something," he said. "Okay," she said. He looked at the pine tree in the lot. "I've been in love with you for a while," he said. I don't know exactly when it started. Somewhere between the diner and the kitchen table. Maybe before that. He paused. I'm not saying it because I expect anything from it. I'm saying it because it's true and I'm tired of knowing something's true and not saying it. She looked at his profile, the lines at the corners of his eyes, the jaw that didn't move unnecessarily, the hands resting on his knees with the stillness of someone who had made peace with what they'd just put down. Ethan, she said. Yeah. I've been in love with you since February, she said. Since you called me on a Thursday night about the Henderson transmission, and I sat in my penthouse for an hour afterward in the dark because it was the best conversation I'd had in years. She paused. I just didn't say it, because every time I tried to figure out how, it seemed like too large a thing for the room. He turned and looked at her. It's too large a thing for this room too, she said. I'm saying it anyway. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, I kissed Sarah on the second date because I couldn't think of anything else that was honest enough. I'm probably going to do the same thing now if that's okay. She didn't say anything. He turned toward her on the porch step, and he kissed her, which was simple and unhurried and not particularly elegant because they were sitting on porch steps at an awkward angle and neither of them was 20 years old. And it was true in the same way that all the other true things in this story had been true, without performance, without calculation, without anything in it except the thing itself. She put her hand against his jaw, which needed a shave, and he let her. And the summer night came down off the mountain the way summer nights did, slowly, warm, indifferent to all the human reckoning happening below it. Later, after she'd gone inside to call her assistant about a morning meeting she needed to reschedule, Ethan sat on the steps alone for a little while and looked at the sky. He thought about what it meant to have stopped on Ridgeline Road. He'd been asked about it by the state trooper and by Marcus, and once, obliquely, by Daniel in a late-night phone call a month after the accident. Why stop? Why go down that slope in the dark and the cold for someone he couldn't see and didn't know? He'd given different versions of the same answer, that it was just what you did, that someone was in the car, that he'd been trained for it, all of which were true and none of which was the whole truth. The whole truth was simpler and harder to say. He'd stopped because he was still the person who stopped. 11 years in the Navy, 3 combat deployments, a marriage and a loss, and 3 years of rebuilding from the floor up. None of it had changed the fundamental thing, which was that he was someone who saw a person in trouble and moved toward them. Not because of training, though the training helped. Not because of calculation, just because that was the shape of him, worn down into him so deep it wasn't a decision anymore. It was just what he did. He hadn't known that night on Ridgeline that moving toward that car would lead here. To this porch, to that table inside, to a boy asleep down the hall with a piece of rhodochrosite on his windowsill next to the other rocks. Life didn't give you that kind of information in advance. It just gave you the moment, the ice on the road, the dark slope, the faint light of a headlamp cutting into the trees. And you either moved or you didn't. He had moved. Everything else had followed from that, in the way that all the real things followed from the one honest moment that started them. The swing moved on the porch in the light wind, and the mountains were dark against the summer stars, and inside the house were the 2 people who had become, without any particular planning, the reason the house was a home rather than just a building he slept in. He wasn't a man who believed that things happened for reasons. He'd seen too much of how random and indifferent the world could be to hold that kind of faith. Some things just happened. Some storms just came. Some roads just iced. But sometimes, in the middle of the random and the indifferent, a person made a choice. A small one. A truck pulling to the shoulder, a door forced open in the cold, that changed the shape of everything that came after it. He got up from the steps and went inside. Noah's door was open, the way he still slept, the old habit from the months after Sarah, when he'd needed to know the door was open even if he didn't know why. Ethan stopped in the doorway. The bedside lamp was off. The windowsill was lit faintly by the outside light coming through the glass, and he could see the shoebox of rocks on the sill, and the edge of the field guide on the nightstand, and Noah's hand on the blanket, relaxed in sleep, the hand of a child whose heart was repaired and whose body was doing what it was supposed to do. On the windowsill, next to the shoebox, the rhodochrosite caught the light and held it, red and still and solid, the way some things were, when you finally found the right place to put them down. Ethan stood in the doorway for a moment. Then he went down the hall toward the sound of Claire's voice, low and unhurried, telling someone on the phone to move the meeting to 11. She was at the kitchen table, the one with the puzzle box and the crayon drawing still stuck to the refrigerator. And when he came in, she looked up and her expression did the thing it did. The open, unguarded thing. And she said to the phone, without looking away from him, "I have to go. Move it to 11. It's fine." She put the phone down. He sat across from her at the table. "The meeting's at 11 now," she said. "I heard," he said. She looked at him with the slight, real smile that was different from all the other kinds she had. "What?" "Nothing," he said. "You're just here." She looked at him for a moment, then at the table, then back at him. "I am," she said. "I'm glad," he said. Outside, the summer night continued being what it was, warm and dark and full of the sound of the mountains settling, the creek running somewhere below the tree line, the pine moving against the sign in the lot. And inside the house on Creek Road, a garage mechanic and a billionaire CEO sat at a kitchen table with a puzzle box between them and said nothing in particular, because sometimes the most complete thing in the world was just two people in the same room, both of them choosing to stay.